My name is Joanna Abajowdy, and I'm the Museum Associate at the FIDM Museum and Galleries, and I'm interviewing Harry Rotz, who was the head milliner at Western Costume.
That is correct. It's an artistic endeavor. It's not a textbook endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
It's an artistic endeavor that should grow organically from the materials, from the research, and from ideas. You have to be open to something changing as things change or materials change. You have to be open to it, and that's why there are particular designers that I just loved working with, like Joanna Johnston and Bob Ringwood and Rita Ryak. We're so open to having input. I mean, that's why they hire us as artists, is to bring our experience to that situation, not to be dictated to. I relied on the designer who had already done all that research, spent all that time, and had a particular vision for the production, to bring that vision to me and say, this is what we're looking at. Here's the research that we're looking at. I could do some of that research, and I did do a lot of the research myself, but unless I've had some input from them of what they're looking for, I'm inventing the wheel.
So you're really going off the vision that they've dictated.
Yes, that they're working toward.
And of course with period work, the question always comes up of accuracy. Was that ever something that was a discussion, or were people open to sort of period interpretations? How did you deal with that, or did it vary, of course, by designer, by production?
It varied by the designer particularly.
Okay.
Some people weren't as, and also the director. I mean, certain directors are very specific about that. Certain directors, not so much.
Did you have a preference?
It really depended on the production and the designer. I mean, I really wanted to please the designers, and my job was to give the designers what they were looking for and what they needed for their production. And of course, I liked to have a lot of input. I'm a creative person. I've got a big enough ego myself, and I love having input. But not everybody wanted that. And somebody like Joanna Johnston, depends on what movie, because one of my favorite films I've ever done, and it was probably one of the last important movies of my career, was Lincoln. Sally Field as Mary Todd, of course, and they had to be spot on. I mean, for the scale, because Sally is so small, I mean, she's not a big person. The scale becomes super important. And the 1860s particularly have all this trim and layers of ruffles and big, long, wide ribbons, and all that can engulf a small face pretty easily. And Joanna on that particularly was pretty specific about period, because you're representing a very specific time and a very specific person, and an image that everybody is familiar with. So you can't get too arty with that. But something like Rita Ryak's bedtime stories was more of a fantasy. We were doing multiple periods, but you could do anything you want. It's a comedy. It didn't really matter,
Sure.
So it really depends on the project and the designer.
You mentioned Sally Field. Just wondering how you work with actors. Is it just in the fitting period? Do they ever give input? I'm sure some of your designs are based on who's going to be wearing it. How does that process work for you?
I mostly worked with the actors in fittings. I really didn't like being on set. That was never my thing. Oh, man. Talk about egos. And everybody was a boss on set. Everybody had their idea of what had to be done. And I didn't need to be there. I just didn't need to be there. I think I would go to set every once in a while if it was a larger shoot, just to make, if it was like a crowd scene or something. But with principals, by the time it's on set, it's a done deal. And some people just really want to be on set. They want to be near the talent. They love the hubbub and all of that. That was never me. I was perfectly happy to be in my little shop with my crew making things. I'm all about making things. My whole career, from the time I was a kid, as a young craftsperson, was about making things.
What inspired you to make hats?
When I went to Juilliard, and I wasn't hired as an apprentice to go to the millinery department. At the beginning, they tried to make me a cutter fitter, and I was patterning flat patterns. And I didn't really like flat patterning because I really like to make three-dimensional objects, and that became obvious pretty quickly. And the milliner there didn't really have an assistant. She mostly worked by herself. And I helped her with a few things, and we liked each other. And then the first big project was a production of La Boheme, and she needed several assistants, and I became her main assistant because I was sort of in-house. And that was really the beginning of my career in the sense that I was able to help her out constructing. And I was also the liaison from her to the workers, the milliners. There were milliners, but not designers or pattern makers or anything like that. And quite frankly, Eve wasn't the nicest person to them. One of the things I learned from her is how to work with the crew, because people didn't like her. I learned what not to do and how to treat people. And I think that's a very important lesson as you continue your career and you're running a crew. You know, those are long, hard days. You want people to be in a good mood. And quite honestly, that was one of my big lessons from her. Yes, she taught me how to make hats, and she was a wonderful teacher. But I learned far more from her than just the mechanics of hat making.
Can you walk me through your process a little bit? Do you make a sketch first?
Well, again, when I was working on films, most of the designers came with ideas of what they wanted, which varied. I like to see the materials. I want to know what I'm going to make this out of, because then, depending on the outer fabric, that sort of changes what the structural materials are on occasion. My own art, my own design, I really work from the materials first. Like, I get a group of fabrics or feathers or flowers or objects that start to take shape in my mind more as a three-dimensional object than just a particular style of hat. I didn't get a lot of sketches. Sketches are a theater thing. People had a lot of time for sketches. In film work, nobody sketches anymore. Research, they bring me reams of research, or they send me things on the internet, online, because so much is online now. Any period reference you want is online. So there's no hours in the library anymore like it used to be. Nor do film designers have the time to sit and sketch. The last sketches I got were from a designer named Wayne Finkelman, who was a wonderful designer, and his process was all about sketching. He designed as he sketched the character. But that, honestly, rarely happens. Now they make the sketch after the costume's done. I think my first big film in Los Angeles was probably The Color Purple, designed by Agnes Rogers. I did G.I. Joe 2. Was it G.I. Joe? Yeah, G.I. Joe, the second one, which was also one of the harder things that we had to do. We made, oh my God, we must have made 4 dozen or 5 dozen balaclavas, those hoods that the ninjas wear. They were for the ninjas out of this rubberized fabric, but we had to put disappearing zippers in them on the sides. And that was just not easy. And I am all about my crew. You know, nobody does this by themselves. I am only as good as my crew. And they were stellar, I have to say. And putting disappearing zippers in rubberized stretch fabric was just really a challenge.
Do you work with the same crew on most films? Do you sort of have the people that you take with you from film to film, or how does that work?
I did, yes. There were a group of us who were craftspeople in the industry, and we are still friends, and I tended to bring the same people on when I could if they weren't on another film or they weren't out of town on location. Yeah, and as I say, nobody works in a vacuum. You know, I'm only as good as my crew. I can't. When you have 50 hats to make, you're not stitching everything yourself.
Sure. How the field has changed since you first started. You know, your first days at Juilliard and then on Broadway to the film industry. What kind of changes have you seen?
I think a lot of changes. I would just reference my 30 years in Hollywood. There's less time, there's less money, less research. They rush ahead before they even have a script.
Wow.
We're asked to make things. Oh, well, we need 50 of these, so go ahead and start. And then the scene's cut before they've even started shooting. That's a little silly in my book.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive if there's not as much money either.
Well, exactly. And then, of course, they've changed it, you know, to a different country now, so you have to rush and make all these other hats that they are going to shoot. That didn't used to happen. It was much more considered, I think, years ago. In terms of the process, I think the people coming into the field these days, and this is including the directors, they don't read as much as they need to. I mean, read books. They don't have the reference, the historical reference for certain things, or just don't care. And that's kind of sad to me. I'm an avid reader. I've always read, particularly historical novels, biographies, and I never considered myself the most educated person about history, but what history I know comes from my research of films. And then I was like, oh, that's an interesting period. I want to read more about that period or more about that person. And I don't think people read as much as they need to now to have the historical references that they need to carry through that project. There's significant changes. So you don't have the education, or you're going to skip school, you're going to skip college, but you're just going to go right into the industry making stuff because that's where the money is. Well, that's only going to get you so far.
Right. And it sounds like you really had a true apprenticeship. You know, you were really being passed a craft down with hands-on teaching. Do you feel like that still happens?
I would like to think so. I mean, that was, I did have a real apprenticeship. I had mentors even in college, as I say, that brought me along. I'd like to think that I had a certain amount of interest that they recognized. I was willing to do whatever they asked me to because I was at Juilliard. I didn't care if I was making coffee. You know, I was working at Lincoln Center.
Yeah.
And not all the apprentices felt that way. They were a little snooty when they were asked to do certain tasks.
Okay.
I never felt that way. And when I hired my crews, I was more than willing to teach them because nobody knows how to make hats. You know, when I brought people into the shop, they didn't have specific millinery experiences. They just had crafts experiences, or they were stitchers. And so it was my job to teach them specific millinery techniques and to show them how I wanted it done. I didn't care how their last boss wanted it done. This is how I want it done. And I was very clear about that. And I was very lucky to have some incredible artists to work with me, usually people that stayed with me for a while. The woman who took over the shop at Western Costumes when I retired, I had worked with on various projects for 10 or 15 years, really.
Oh, wow.
And then I had hired her at Western, and she stayed with me for 5 years full-time at Western, and then took over the shop when I left. It was wonderful. My advice is to go work in theater, get a job in one of the many repertory theaters around the country, and I just think it's the best proving ground there is. I really do. After all these years, the apprentices or the craftspeople that I hired that had spent their time in theater came to me with more knowledge and a better attitude than people who were just walking in off the streets or fashion. A lot of people came from fashion, which is all just contemporary, but they had no period background.
No reference points.
No reference points for history or period, which wasn't what I wanted.
Well, I think we've covered most of the questions that we had set out to talk about. Do you have anything else to add for the audience in New York?
Forrest Gump was one of my favorite projects, too. I had mentioned having made Sally Fields hats in Forrest Gump. But there are so many hats in that movie. When you look at that film, there's just so many pieces. Even the early KKK scene, we had to make period KKK hats. In my career, I've worked with Goldie Hawn, who was just as charming, and Meryl Streep, both of them for Death Becomes Her. It was one of my favorites. It's a really overlooked movie. It's so charming. Bruce Willis is terrific. And having fittings with Meryl Streep, Isabella Rossellini, and Goldie Hawn was one of the highlights of my career. The three of them were so charming and so sweet and so inclusive that it made it a pleasure to work with them. It really did. Very professional people. It really was a thrill, I have to say. It really was.